So I actually didn't mention it in the news video today because I just figured no point in teasing it. Might as well just talk about it all here and just flush it out today. So for those of you guys tuning in, this is basically the follow up to the first conversation that I had with Mr. Armendis, and now the moderation team of several platforms, along with certain vendors, have kind of come together, from what I can tell, to uh, kind of be able to tell the public what the current vendor rating system is starting to shape up like. So we have Armendis back again to kind of go over with us what they've come up with so far.
It's been, how long has it been since we did the first video? It's been about a month or so, just over a month.
Yeah, a month. I think almost 2 months, maybe.
Almost 2 months.
Yeah.
So, we don't have to rehash it. If any of your viewers are seeing this for the first time, recommend they go check it out. Maybe you can give them the
I'll
link.
have it linked somewhere.
Awesome. And don't want to dwell on any of the bad stuff because I know a lot has happened since then. We've been keeping in touch to right on like vendors that have been kind of having troubles. But out of this comes, I think, a silver lining in that it's kind of created a cross group collaboration to try and at least take a stab at giving consumers some sort of mechanism that they can reference to see, at the very least, kind of like a history of vendors that they're considering joining group buys from. And that's not really something we've had in the past. You kind of have to go to GeekHack or other places to kind of get a sense of what it is. And even recently, I think we saw a vendor, Noxery, that had kind of a bit of a questionable past, but a lot of new people didn't know about that coming into it and joined many of his group buys. And unfortunately, it doesn't look like that's going pretty well right now. And so, part of it is we wanted to take a little time to build something that, had we had it before, it might have given people a bit of a warning. It's not a perfect system, and I'm not saying it would have solved everything, but the team has really worked hard to put something together that I think is a good start, right? Consider it an MVP, a minimal viable product, right? That with the community feedback, hopefully we can improve and make it something that really helps.
Yeah, and I mean, I did take a look at the draft you sent, and I mean, you guys applied the current rating system to some current events, so hopefully it's a good enough. Hopefully it's a good working start. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd be happy to kind of share it, and we can walk through it, and then people.
Yes,
can
of course.
Let me share my screen. Okay, so I actually registered a domain for this. It makes it easy because people aren't going to remember a
nice
document. So MK Trust, Mechanical Keyboard Trust and Safety System, is what it stands for. Right now, it just goes to a Google Doc. It's not a very polished site or anything like that. It's simply a set of Google documents for now. And as mentioned, it's meant to be kind of an MVP product, right? That we improve over time. It could evolve to something more sophisticated, like a website and tracking mechanism and all that stuff. But for now, it's pretty modest. So it's a Google Doc it's a bunch of it's a Google Doc and a bunch of forms and spreadsheets, but this is kind of the document is kind of the main central point, if you will. And it's not, this looks long and complicated, but if you're a consumer, all you have to do is look at this one page, right? And you'll see we don't have the vendors all rated or have ratings yet, but we put some examples here where you'll see them. And we are working on the actual ratings. We've had about 11 vendors submitted so far. We hope that once this goes public, both through you and we'll have it listed on platforms, that other vendors will submit and will submit their information, and we'll start ranking them. So, or rating them, I beg your pardon. So here's Canon keys, for example, right? And the way this works is you'll have kind of a summary, right, of all the vendors here with their rating and how many active group buys, and then you can click on this detail to go and see all the details. And I'll come back to this. So let me stick to the document for now, and kind of explain how how the system works, right? So there's a rating that's given, and the rating is really dependent on three main objective measures, right? And three commitments that they make, and then based on what their rating is, there's some sort of limitation to how many group buys they can promote on the participating platforms. So it's basically, you start out, if you're a brand new vendor, right? The criteria, the first three kind of objective measures are how many successful group buys you've run, how many employees you have. This is an important one, and I'll explain why in a minute. And how many years you've operated continuously without a failed group buy. Okay, so if you're a new vendor starting out, obviously you'd have less than 3 group buys, probably one employee, and you've been running for less than a year. You would get a rating of N, which means new vendor. Okay, what you have to commit to be rated is you have to commit to regular group buy updates, and we know how much some vendors struggle to do that, right? So regular group buy updates, and it's defined, further down. I'll show you in the definitions what that means. You have to, in some cases, if you're ranked or rated an N or a B, you have to agree to share minimum order quantities for key sets, and the reason for that is it gives consumers a sense of how much of that key set group buy is funded by the actual people, the consumers versus the vendor. Once the vendor becomes more established, that's not as important, and they have to commit to responding to both customers through some sort of ticketing system, or to admins if we're trying to reach them because if there's some issue within a certain number of business days, right? And so basically, based on these 3 criteria, the more successful group buys you run, and the more employees you have, and the more years you've run without a continuous, without any failures, helps you climb these ratings. Okay. Now, minimum employee contacts is interesting. It's a little contentious. I'll explain what.
I was just about to ask about that.
Yeah. So here's the challenge with it. And by the way, this is not all set in stone. So this could evolve. We'll get feedback from vendors, the community. It's going to evolve, right? And this is by no means, I think, the perfect system. It may never be perfect. This is the closest we got after lots of discussion with lots of people in the community across vendors and moderators, administrators, streamers like yourself, and so on, right? Designers, key set designers, keyboard designers, all those folks. And I'll show you the full list. It's pretty exhaustive, and we're very grateful that everybody participated. But if you look at Taeha, like, let's take Project Keyboard for example, right? Before they had issues, arguably that was a fairly successful vendor. They had run several keyboard group buys, several key set group buys. They were communicating and all those things. We have no idea what's happened to him, right? Hopefully he's okay, but he's completely abandoned. The company was put in bankruptcy. There's the inventory. The landlord who owns the warehouse is trying to now liquidate the inventory. It's a total mess, right? And if you didn't have this criteria, okay, if you didn't have this criteria, a number of employees, then that Project Keyboard would have had a fairly good rating. Okay. The problem is, if you're a one-man operation, the point of failure is super high risk, right? If something happens to you, heaven forbid, you get sick, incapacitated, something happens, the entire operation is at risk, right? And this is a common characteristic with almost every vendor that's failed, by the way. Most vendors who fail are one-man operations, right? So Noxery, Project Keyboard, Santiago Customs, right? You can go on and on and on. Now, that's not to say that there's no risk with larger vendors, as we saw with Mexico. But the point of failure with one person operations is distinctly high, right? And so that is why, after much discussion, we came up with this. Now, it's not to say that you can't have a low risk rating with one person. For example, Oblatsky, right? Incredibly reliable, hardworking community pillar of a vendor. Even though he has run many, many group buys and has been around for a long time, under this rating system would not be able to go beyond a B because he's a one-man operation. So we have to think about how to solve that. There could be, ways to solve it, and there's suggestions. This doesn't incorporate all the suggestions, even though this is 15 pages. For example, maybe one-man operations can have a backup vendor or can share information with the admin team around, who's purchased what for outstanding group buys, so that, for example, in Project Keyboard, if we had that information on who had bought which key sets, if we were able to get a hold of the inventory, we can then, another vendor or somebody else can distribute that or contact the customers who had purchased those items, right? Mm-hmm. But without any of that information, it's objectively a one-person vendor is very high risk.
Got it.
Right.
And then can I ask a couple more questions?
Yeah, please. Sorry, I've been talking about
so the minimum number of successful group buys, is that just like ever? Or is that dependent also with the continuous years of number of no failed group buys?
These are
those two separate?
They're separate things, but you have to meet all the criteria. So what that means is you may have been around for 5 years, but only run 8 successful group buys. You can only be an A.
Okay, got it. Okay.
Does it make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Right.
And then
conversely, you may have run a lot of group buys, but you've only been around for 3 years, right? You can only be a double A. But I want to be very clear, and we were very deliberate about choosing these ratings, right? Anything B and above is low risk, right? Like these are people who have, established decent, track record, and we'll come up with a way for one-man operations maybe to, climb the ratings a bit more, as I said. But they're all marked as low risk for a reason, right? This is not meant to be. We're not trying to give a relative ranking of a vendor. This is purely a rating, a rating of, risk, a risk factor for you to consider. But there's minimal difference in many cases, and the whole point of having all the details right in the sheet is that you can go and make that decision yourself beyond whatever rating's been given. You can look at the data yourself and see whether you think it's a trustworthy vendor for you.
One more question. This is a hypothetical. Let's say a vendor would be AAA rating, but their ticketing system takes a week, but everything else, it checks the tick marks. Where would they slot in that case?
So again, based on feedback from vendors themselves, we picked these numbers, and they have not indicated that this is an issue. 3 business days response, right? Now, if there's an occasional slippage and somebody takes 4 or 5 business days, like, we're not looking to hold their feet to the fire on this. This is meant to really be, what is typically an indicator of impending failure is when they simply ghost people completely, right? So when people are submitting tickets and they're like, man, I haven't heard from weeks from this vendor, or they're not giving any updates, right? There's no group buy updates. Those are usually the signs. So this is less like a hard and fast rule and more of a guideline to say, hey, you have to be responsive to us if we're trying to reach you, or to customers if they're trying to reach you with problems, right? And you'll see in the mechanism of how this works is it is reliant on customers to inform us when there's a problem. We can't, it's impossible for a small group of administrators to monitor every group, every key set or keyboard group by across every vendor, right? So it's dependent on people telling us if there's an issue, and we'll talk about the mechanism for that.
Okay.
Right. So, and I forgot to mention, this is specifically for key set and keyboard group buys. We are not covering. We're not covering vendors who do other group buys for other types of products, and we're not covering the group buys for vendors that are covered that are not key sets and keyboards. It's only key set and keyboard. Why is that? Is because those are the items that tend to get people in trouble the most.
Got it.
Right. We could expand from here to cover other things. One that comes to mind is cables, notoriously difficult, right? Or challenging for some vendors. But that's not, if we're being honest, that's not where the millions of dollars in failed group buys have come from. It's been primarily key sets and keyboards.
Until there is that one big cable group buy or something.
Yeah, well, hopefully, yeah, the mother of all cable group buys. Yeah. There have been some fairly big vendors that have messed that up, but it's still a fraction of the financial, right? Not to say that this can't cover it. We just wanted to focus on these two products first because that's far and away the biggest challenge. There's some other nuances in here about so for example, if you're a designer or a keyboard, a key set or keyboard designer, you'll understand the nuances of proxies versus lead vendors. So there are some nuances in terms of how we set the limits. So for example, if you are primarily a regional proxy and you've got a AAA rating, but you've done primarily proxies, not led group buys, then there's a limit in how many group buys you can lead if you decide to start leading them. And that's based on the percentage of successful group buys you've led. So there's a little bit of a nuance. Again, you don't need to know all those details. That's primarily for the admin group to determine the rating, right? But we have taken those types of things into consideration.
And I guess we should also clarify for viewers, based on that first chart, vendors will have both a vendor rating that's separate from a proxy rating, correct?
Sorry, no. This is just an example of let's just call it vendor two. Yeah, everybody has one rating. We want to keep that simple. So we didn't want to give different ratings for you. Everybody has one rating. Vendors will be limited on the group buys they can promote that are where they're leads, depending on how many they've led.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
So if they're primarily the primary intent of that is if you're a really, really well-known proxy, successful proxy, you've done hundreds of proxy key sets, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that all of a sudden you can start being a great lead vendor.
Right.
Right. So you'll have a high limit. You'll be able to promote lots of proxies, but a smaller number of lead group buys. Until you build up that track record. And the details for that are all explained in here for those of you who are vendors or designers and want to know how it works with examples and all those things, right? So the group buy post limits, there's a baseline. Everyone has 3 group buys that they can be a lead or proxy for. The limit of how many you can promote in total is 2x the successful group buy threshold for that rating, and the number of group buys a vendor can lead is based on the percentage of successful group buys they ran. But everyone gets a minimum of 3, right? So not to, again, bore people with the math, but I'll just run through this one quickly. Let's say there's a small vendor with 1 employee. They've been in operation for a couple of years. They've run 4 successful group buys. They led 3 of them, and one of them was they were a proxy for 1. So 75% of their successful group buys they were the lead on. Okay, they would be, based on this criteria, they would have a B rating. and their group by limit would be 3 plus 2 times the successful group by rating threshold, which is 3. So they'd have a total of, they'd be able to promote a total of 9 group buys. But of those 9, they could only promote themselves as a lead on 7, because that's 75%.
Got it.
So it's basically like, again, the consumers don't need to worry about this stuff. This is more for administrators to set the limits. But your ability to promote group buys grows, and your ability to promote a lead grows as you've led more successfully.
Right.
It makes sense, right? So you can't be like, if you're a super successful proxy, but all of a sudden we allow you to promote a ton of leads, you could fail. And we don't want, we want to avoid that, right? So you have to build up your ability to lead group buys. Let's take Project Keyboard as not Project Keyboard, Mexico as an example, right? And it's very interesting. We found this. We noticed that Keycap Lender, and these guys, the developer helped us get to this information. We've mentioned him in the acknowledgments. It's very interesting to look at the data, which I wish I had brought up last time. But they have a whole statistics section. And if you go to the statistics, a little slow, so let's give it a minute to load. There's a lot of data behind this. You can actually see how many group buys were run over I think they have 2 years is how long they keep this data. Very interesting, and you can sort it by vendor. So look at this. Okay, so let's take a look at some very interesting data here. So if you go down to the bottom, you'll see lead vendors, typically North America, Mexico, for example. Okay, so you can see at the peak, okay, in 2021, Mexico, this is number of key set group buys that were initiated that month. So they were opening at the peak 3-4 key set group buys a month.
What do you mean by open?
Like launching, like here's a new key set group buy we're launching.
Okay, so like not interest check, like the group buy was open.
Opening a group buy.
Okay. Wow.
Okay, now let's go up like to some other well-known ones, right? Here's a Watsky, right? Here's Novel Keys, right? 3-4 key sets a month. Now, here's the interesting thing. These are lead vendors, right? In North America, the Watskys in Europe, granted. They all need to pick proxies, right? To run in Asia. There's a limited number of proxies that all of these guys can pick from. So what does that mean for proxies? Let's go take a look. Those limited number of proxies were then opening how many group buys a month? Europe, Asia, Australia, Europe. 15 to 20 group buys a month. Right? Staggering amount.
Yeah.
So if you are, and by the way, like major kudos to these guys like Prototypist for weathering this storm. They had lower volume per group buy, but extremely high group buy volume.
Right.
And so if Prototypist, I'm just going to pick on great vendor, by the way. I'm just going to pick, like, let's say you had a vendor like this that was running lots of key sets as a proxy. It doesn't necessarily mean that all of a sudden they can start being successful at leading keyboard group buys, for example, right? So we need to set a threshold that allows them to do many proxy group buys, but not all of a sudden start promoting a ton of leads. Right? That's what this mechanism does.
Right. I guess just to clarify for viewers, like I mean, not to pick on Prototypists, but like even if they might have like 20 running sets for a month, like they are based in the UK.
Mhm.
Like one group buy as a proxy maybe might have 20 or less orders at a time. So
Much smaller volume,
yeah,
right?
just
Much
difference in
smaller volume.
scale. Yeah, that's very
Correct.
interesting.
But it's actually like, and why I say kudos to these guys, it's still a lot of work because of the coordination of all the group buys.
Right. Yeah.
The good ones will, I am confident, weather the storm, and this will hopefully kind of provide some modicum of trust, right, indicating that these are good vendors, the ones that survive.
Hmm.
Right?
Was that
So
chart always available?
yeah, who knew?
Okay, I guess I just learned.
Yeah, shout out to these guys.
Yeah, I mean this is
Uh,
great.
it's fantastic information. Obviously, only key sets, but great information. Uh, Eskimojo and
Mm,
Torcall, the developers of this site. This is, I think he mentioned this was like a project for him, a side project.
mm.
Fantastic, fantastic site, and they're sponsors of this site. I think they're listed at the bottom here somewhere. But Prototypist and others are, there's some other vendors that sponsor this site. So thanks to the sponsors. Very good site.
Yeah.
We're talking with him about potentially, you know, having to manually track this is pain for the admin team. So there could be things that we do to work with companies like or sites like Keycap Lender to, aggregate some of this data and make it easier to track. So for those of you who want to go deeper, because you're looking for a cure for insomnia or you're masochistic, there's plenty of stuff here. So we go into all the terms and definitions of what we mean by a vendor. And you had asked a great question about pre-orders. And this is something important to point out, that for the purposes of this rating system, we consider pre-orders and this new thing called made to order or rolling fulfillment to all be the same thing as a group buy.
Okay.
Okay? Meaning we're limiting vendors on how many group buys, pre-orders, rolling fulfillment, whatever they can promote, right? Based on how successful they were in the past at fulfilling these things. Interest checks, this does not apply to interest checks. Now, I know there's a little drama around RMK, Reddit MK specifically, that they've paused on interest checks for a while. They're going to define this and let those reopen them, right? Because what they were dealing with were some vendors who were abusing this concept to basically advertise a group buy. Like if you do an interest check and say, hey, we're running this group buy next week, right? That's not an interest check, right? That's an advertisement. And so they were dealing with that. And there are lots of people like keyset designers and others who really need this mechanism genuinely to determine whether there's interest and or promote an upcoming group buy. But further down the road, it's an actual interest check. It doesn't mean the group buy is guaranteed to run.
Yeah.
So that'll be that. For the purposes of this system, we don't apply. It doesn't apply to this doesn't apply to interest checks. Meaning, there's no limitations on interest checks, or interest checks don't determine ratings or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Successful group buy, pretty simple. It's product shipped to customers. It can get complicated. So, for example, even after products are shipped to customers, there's issues with key set alignments, scuffs on keyboards and all those things. The intent is that, look, it's meant to be, a lot. We didn't want to put in a percentage, but like a high percentage of people are happy. There's no mass returns, things like that, right? That constitutes a successful group buy. And a vendor who's the lead on the successful group buy will get credit as the lead. A vendor who's a proxy will get credit as a proxy. It's possible that a vendor who's a proxy may fail and the lead may succeed, or vice versa. Project Keyboard is a good example. They were the lead on many key sets. They failed, but the proxies are fulfilling their end.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So those guys will get credit. They're not going to get dinged because the lead failed, and vice versa.
Mm. Oh, another hypothetical,
Mm-hmm.
which I'm hoping is a rare thing moving forward. But like novel keys, for example, they've been picking up after Mexico and Project Keyboard now.
Yep.
Would they get, or like for future instances such as this, would that vendor get credit for the extra group buys that they end up picking up?
It's a great question. The answer is we're not sure. So again, massive credit to both Canon Keys and Novel Keys for stepping in and picking up some of those group buys from Mexico. We haven't thought about how to deal with that. In full disclosure, Canon Keys and Novel Keys are going to be like double AAA rated vendors anyway, so it won't impact their rating. But we want to give them recognition somehow, right? Because that was a fantastic effort, and I was disappointed to see a post on Reddit complaining about not having that open up long enough or something. But putting that aside, it was a Herculean effort, and we should all be grateful for them to them for that. Don't know, but it wouldn't affect them even if we gave them credit. They're already double AAA vendors. But it does bring up an interesting point, which we have captured as potentially a future item, which is, can we have such a thing as backup vendors or a vendor backup network, right? For vendors in case they fail. So what is there a mechanism we can put in place, especially for those one-man operations, smaller or newer vendors, where the larger ones can step in and help them if something happens?
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Right? Don't know, but it's something that this situation has surfaced as a potential, mechanism to figure out if we can have. Okay. Failed group buy. We got to define it, and there might be some gray area here, but a failed group buy is considered failed if it is unfulfilled and unrefunded, right? So if it was unfulfilled but they gave everybody the money back, it won't be counted as a failed group buy.
Okay.
Right? But if they didn't give the product and they didn't give the money back, then obviously it's a failure. Within a certain time period, because we know group buys can go beyond the initial estimate. We've currently set it at either the lesser of 6 months from when they initially planned they would deliver it, or 500 days from the close of the group buy. This is plenty of buffer for overrun. Plenty, right? So if it takes, if it hits either 6 months or 500 days from the close of group buy, whichever is faster, and they haven't fulfilled it and it's unrefunded, we would consider that failed. And
question.
Yeah.
So let's say it's unfulfilled, but it is refunded. So that's not a failed group buy, but does that count as a successful group buy? Would that be a net zero in terms of successful group buy count?
You're saying it's unfulfilled, but they refunded it?
Yes.
It's not counted as success or failure. Okay. No harm, no foul.
Okay.
And we'll have some exceptions where, look, sometimes manufacturers struggle, or if they're being transparent and communicative and no one's concerned, then maybe there's an exception. I don't think this is going to be like a hard and fast rules. It's going to be fairly obvious. It usually is fairly obvious when a group buy has failed. But we have to define it, right? Regular group buy updates. Why is this so hard? Vendor agrees to do email notifications, at least on major milestones, like they've started production, it's received at the warehouse, shipped to the customer, etc., and any changes to delivery or fulfillment ETA. Right? At least do it on this. Vendor agrees to maintain the current status of all unfulfilled group buys on some channel of their choice between webpage or Discord on at least a monthly basis. This should be the minimum if you're going to be a vendor. Dear vendors, please. If you cannot do these, do not become a vendor. Do not open group buys. Okay? If you opened up a group buy thread on GeekHack, they already have their own requirements on GeekHack where you have to provide updates on that thread. So please do that. And we have, in support of ECAC, put that here as well.
So I'm going to assume this is not something that the admin team is going to actively keep track of, because
We
there's
will
no
not
way.
keep track. We cannot. But as I mentioned, there is a
It's something
mechanism
that we can
for
report.
customers to report to us.
Right. Okay.
And
Got it.
very important. I'll come to that. Right.
Okay.
I'll come to the kind of how this works. We're still in the definitions. He said this just basically defines what all the criteria means, right? What is a customer ticketing? What does admin communications mean, et cetera, et cetera. Employee contacts, very important. At least one person has to be a grown adult. We've had amazing amount of feedback before we added this. Hey, please, you can't have a vendor of all 14-year-olds. Right? So at least one, this is the bare minimum. People are like, what do you mean? Like, shouldn't they all be 21? Let's start here and see how it goes. No offense to our young folks. I know many of whom can be hardworking. Participating network. So these are all of the people who are participating in the system, including yourself. We'll talk about that. Thank you for doing that. Vendors, platforms, streamers, and other entities who agree to participate in the safety system, and we'll define what it means when they participate. Trust and Safety Admin Team is a group of administrators and moderators from the platforms in the network who basically take on the role of helping with the system, to maintain the system. And then you have a variety of other documents, but I'm not going to click them yet because I want to show them to you in the context of this. Okay, so we finished the definition. So how does the system work? There are basically two main forms that either vendors submit or members can submit. Vendors submit information to us to either create a profile or to update their profile. So they submit their profile, we review the vendor profile and the history, we verify the information to the best of our ability, and then we update the trust and safety rating sheet based on that information. Okay. Members in the community, consumers or other vendors or whoever, remember we had an issue where vendors were afraid to report other vendors. This is a mechanism for them to do that. So vendors or community members can submit a form to report potential issues with a vendor. They're not doing updates, they're ghosting people on tickets, whatever, right? We will review that information, contact the vendor to investigate. If the information is verified, we then take action to update the trust and safety ratings accordingly. This is how this is the core. That's why it's impossible for us to do it on our own. It requires input from both the vendors and community members. This is truly like a community-driven trust system. Once those ratings are updated, then the participating network is sort of like the incentive, the enforcement mechanism or the incentive. So if you're not rated, for example, there are some platforms that have signed up that said, hey, if you're not rated in this system, you won't be able to promote your group buys. Influencers like yourself have said, hey, if you're rated here, we will let the people know that you're a rated vendor. And if you're rated poorly as a D, we will not promote your product. Right? So there's different, incentives or benefits for participating in the system and having a high trust rating. It's truly community driven. Like there's no one person that has, sway over this more than another. It's heavily dependent on vendors to participate. It's voluntary. It's dependent on community members reporting problems, and then the participating network folks helping to reinforce, right, good ratings and sort of penalize people with bad ratings or no ratings. So those links above refer to those. So the trust and safety tracker sheet is where we're essentially tracking everything. Again, if you're just trying to decide whether you're new to the hobby, you want to make sure a vendor is okay, you can just quickly see their rating, and that's all you have to do. But if you want, you can go and drill down and look in great detail as to what's novel keys, details, how many group buys have they run, things like that. And some of these, like Canon keys and novel keys, they've probably done over 100, so it's not a full list. So we'll provide a link to their site to see the full list. It's very impressive looking retrospectively at how much group buys folks like Canon keys and novel keys and others, Omnitype and others have run. Okay, so vendor profile form is what vendors will fill out to submit their information or update their data. Vendor issue report form, let's just take a quick look at this. This is what you can use to report potential issues with, related to customer support or communication delays on key set or keyboard group buys or pre-orders. This is not meant to log trouble tickets to reach a vendor, by the way. If you do that, please do not use this to.
You should probably put that first.
Yeah, we have all of that data here on how to get support, right, for all the vendors. Do not use this to contact the vendor. This is to basically lodge a complaint or report a potential issue, right? That it could be from lack of response, lack of updates, something else. Okay, and then there's a feedback form. This is, again, not a perfect system by any means. It's an MVP. It's got to evolve over time and get better. Please, vendors and community members, if you have any suggestions on how to improve it, please feel free to go ahead and submit this here. Okay, so inputs, vendor profile form, vendor issue report form. We'll verify it. The results are placed in the sheet. The participating network then ensures that those limits are followed. Then we have a little bit more information if you want to see exactly what the criteria is for each rating. This is basically the same thing as the chart above, but spelled out more explicitly for each rating. And I want to point out, and this was asked by several vendors, hey, can a vendor recover from a low rating? And the answer is yes. We want to encourage vendors to recover from a low rating. If they have a failed group buy, let's try and get the product to the customer or get the customer a refund. And if you do that, then you should be able to gradually climb back up in the rating. So this section describes how that can be done. Now, if you've been ranked a D, which means you have one or more failed group buys, it is granted going to be pretty hard to recover. And if you can recover, but we don't want to close that door. If you can recover, you will start at an N. And you have to progressively rebuild your reputation as a new vendor. Okay. There were discussions: should we have an F, meaning we don't want them to ever come back. We didn't want to start out at negative. We might get there. We didn't want to start out with a negative, but that's possible. Yes, we don't want them to come back, even if they want to give refunds.
There's probably a couple on that list.
There's probably a couple. We won't talk about that. Okay, participating network. So these are platform streamers and vendors who have agreed to participate to promote and enforce certain things. So, for example, GeekHack, Reddit Mechanical Keyboards, and Discord Mech Group Buys require that vendors must be rated and can only promote or be listed on keyset or keyboard group buys based on their limit. Meaning they will not allow a vendor who's a new vendor to promote more than 3 group buys on these platforms. And this one is pretty strict. We got to verify this, but at least on GeekHack and our mechanical keyboards, you must be rated. So you have to, if you want to promote a group buy, submit your information and be rated.
Can I ask a question? Mm-hmm. How will that count be enforced? Is that something the admin team will be doing?
The admin teams for these platforms are taking on that responsibility to do their best to enforce that. We will provide the information to them, and they will enforce it. But they'll have to come back to that's why this summary table, either in the sheet or the document, having the limit is important, right? So you'll be able, like, we'll be able to come and see. And by the way, if we miss it, or somebody in the platform misses it, again, a community member can report that, hey, you know, this guy's past his limit. We might have missed it.
Okay.
Right. So they can report it. And I'm sure some will slip. I'm sure. I mean, there's a lot going on. And that's why we wanted to not bite off more than we can chew by trying to support every product. It's just a lot to track, as you would imagine. Discord Mech Market, there's no group buy promotion there, but it does allow people to sell group buy spots. They will not allow any group buy spots to be sold for C or D rated vendors to protect consumers. You, Alex, Otos, and Lightning Keyboards have graciously joined as the first streamers to support this initiative, which means you agree to indicate if a product is being promoted or sold by a vendor who's rated. So you'll give them credit, say, hey, this vendor is rated on the trust and safety system. And you've agreed not to promote any products for any D-rated vendors, who are pretty much vendors like who've completely failed at this point. So they're probably not reaching out to you to promote products. Vendors, we'll list all the vendors that are participating. We're going to open this up for all vendors to join. So if any vendor, if you're listening to this, you can go to mktrust.org, look at this document, submit your vendor profile sheet. And I think we decided any vendor that does this within the next 30 days, so we're trying to get it done by December, you will be given founding vendor status for as long as you hold your rating in the system. So basically anyone who submits, any vendor who, we won't try to encourage vendors to come on board and do this. If they do this by December, you'll receive founding vendor status.
Is there any perk to that?
No, there's no perks other than a cool term.
Okay.
I'm kidding. There might be some perks in the future. Maybe we give them a little bit more limit or something like that. But it is meant to indicate that you helped establish this system, right? You helped establish the system. You're thinking about the community. Over time, I hope that it is a status that is come to be respected. Little disclaimer that maybe should be at the top, but we put it here. This is, and what it's not is as important, but so this is meant to be a trust and safety classification for vendors currently who are running key set and keyboard group buys. It's meant to be an indicator of potential risks that consumers should consider when joining a group buy, a keyboard or key set group buy run by a vendor. It's based primarily on historical, backwards-looking information and longevity and number of employees. It's not that like mutual fund performance. It's not an indicator of future performance, right? So it's like a PSA document based on available data that can be reported on by you guys, right? So it's as good as the information that we're provided by other vendors and the members. We're not trying to rank vendors. This is not a ranking. It's going to be all alphabetical order. We're not saying one vendor is better than the next or you should buy from this vendor. It's not a ranking. And we're not looking at commissions. It doesn't guarantee that a vendor will succeed or fail. It's trying to simply provide all of the typical caveats that you see on Mech Market and PCAC and other things about group buys still apply. There are no financial disclosures. We did talk about this at great lengths with some of the vendors. It's just too difficult right now to be able to get transparent financial information. We have to preserve, they have confidentiality, they have competitive concerns and all those things. So it's not based on that at the moment. And there's no contractual or legal aspects here. This is purely a voluntary information system. So it's better than nothing, which is what we have today. I think it's significantly better than nothing because if you back test this against vendors, so like let's take Mexico for example, right? They were promoting like a couple dozen group buys before they even fulfilled a single one. Now under this system, they would not have been able to promote more than 3 group buys. A significant limit compared to what they were able to do in the absence of this system,
Mm.
right? Noxery, based on a plethora of issues they've had in the past, would have been rated at most a C under this system. Or at a very minimum, you would have had, historical information on the challenges that vendor had. Because it was very interesting to hear veterans say, what? Noxery is still around? Like they couldn't conceive that he was still around and people were giving him money.
Mm.
Because of all the troubles that he had in the past. But new people didn't know that. There was no historical context for information.
Right.
Right? Project Keyboard, a little bit difficult there, but in the early days where he wasn't responding, we hopefully would have been quickly notified. And maybe, don't know, maybe we would have caught this earlier and contacted GMK or other menus, and maybe there could have been an opportunity to save some of those key sets. Don't know. But again, as a one-man show, he would never have been rated more than a B. And therefore, he would have been limited to at most 9 promoted group buys. Now, could he have promoted more on his own outside of the platforms? Sure. But had anyone come and checked, this would have been his limit, and there would be information there showing that, hey, this vendor is potentially taking on a lot more risk than what their current rating permits.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Would it have stopped people from using him? I don't know, but it would have indicated a problem, potential problem, right? So again, no perfect system. Got to figure out ways to handle truly trustworthy, reliable vendors who are one-man operations, while avoiding the risk that has materialized of others. Then there's a huge, not huge, but fairly detailed FAQ on questions like, how does a vendor get rated? What if what if a vendor does not? By the way, I'm going to call it force rate some vendors for PSA purposes, primarily when they're C or D vendors. Like nobody's going to submit information to us on Noxery, Project Keyboard, or Mexinco now. It's retroactive, so it doesn't really matter, but we will force rank those just to make sure people know. Mm-hmm. And if there are other vendors, and there may be other vendors who are troubled that we don't know of or we don't have official proof of right now, please go ahead and submit information so we can investigate and potentially raise, quote unquote, force rate vendors who may not be trustworthy to warn people. But we will do our due diligence and attempt to contact the vendor and make sure that that's all valid information. We're not trying to screw anybody. But if there are vendors that are struggling, it'd be good for us to know. I do want to mention this, okay? There is this negative sentiment going on around group buys that is perhaps a bit unfair, right? Group buys themselves are not inherently bad. They're just a business model. Yes, they've been responsible for contributing to the failure of some irresponsible vendors, but that doesn't necessarily mean that all group buys are bad. It's, these are fundamentally niche. We're in a niche hobby, selling very niche items at relatively low volume. And it's not feasible to, for vendors to always pre-purchase and sell these as in-stock items. And it still, is an important vehicle to bring cool stuff to market that might not otherwise exist, right? So certainly do your due diligence, and this is one new mechanism we'll have in the community to help do that due diligence. But don't simply say, or assume that all group buys are bad. That's throwing the baby out with the bathwater, I think.
Yeah. And I'm also partly to blame. I was going to have some follow-up videos with existing respectable vendors to kind of advocate for group buys, because I mean the hobby is built on group buys, and it always will be. But I've just been busy, so I haven't brought on any vendors. But yeah, I wholeheartedly agree.
Yeah, I don't think. I mean, people are going to take what they take from your videos, right? And oftentimes, they take the nuance is sometimes missed, right? So I did want to. We can both together make this statement. I think that look, not all vendors are bad, not all group buys are bad. In fact, what this sheet will show you is that the majority of vendors and group buys are successful and good, right? This has been a time of, very difficult due to the market and the peak of COVID, and all this excess inventory has created a difficult situation that has caused vendors to fail, some vendors to fail, but we want to make sure that we continue to support, the great vendors that are still out there, the great designers, who are all part of our community, right? And they've all stepped in. Many of them have stepped in to help, to help when things have gotten difficult. So, please, I still love this community. I think it's amazing, and I'm really proud of all the vendors and folks like yourself and others who stepped in to work on this. It's brings a tear to my eye.
And I mean, hopefully, with more systems like this in place, it'll hopefully bring some positive sentiment back for joining group buys. Now that we have certain, not measures, but at least we can be better informed
history.
Customers.
Yeah, be better informed. Please, if you're a vendor that's watching this, whether you're small or large, and by the way, we've tried very carefully not to make this so that it's favorable only to large vendors. You as a new vendor, you can climb up the ranks with no, just as fast as anybody else. It's not meant to favor. In fact, we've set some of these things where, it's a little bit more strict on larger vendors who have more employees in terms of the response time. So we've tried to strike a balance. Again, it's not perfect, and we're always open to feedback, but we hope that all vendors will participate in this over time and find benefit from it, and the community will continue to support it as well and report information. Some of the things that were discussed, but didn't make this cut, asking vendors for business registration information. Like in the US, you have something called the Dun & Bradstreet number. That's going to be replaced, I think, at the federal level with something else soon. Business address, location of warehouse. Be surprised, like when vendors fail, this information, location of warehouse coupled with backup customer lists would have actually been super helpful to have for some vendors who failed. Because we could physically, have other vendors or other community members go recover some inventory. And if we have who bought what, we can see if we can salvage some stuff. Right? There's a lot of discussion around finances. One of the things that I had thrown out earlier on was, instead of disclosing information, what if you get a third-party accountant to do an attestation that you have, enough assets to cover your liability? But for a variety of reasons, I think that, it's difficult. And so maybe in the future, maybe as an option to have a higher rating, something like that. Background checks of owners. Yeah, that's something to consider. Not that I think any vendors have any shaky people, but as new people come into the hobby, it's not a bad thing to consider. Separate ratings for proxy versus lead vendors. We wanted to keep things simple. So we avoided that for now, but if it becomes an important thing, we can consider it. We've had some smaller vendors say that, hey, it'd be great to be able to build up at least to a B rating with smaller MOQ group buys. So that's something we could consider. So they don't have to take on like a large MOQ, group buy. Running periodic community surveys to gather feedback. This is absolutely something we could consider. Having a centralized, publicly visible place for vendors to update the group by status. So technically, we're not a centralized reporting mechanism, meaning the only thing that this requires is vendors to provide a group by status on their web page or Discord or whatever. Over time, maybe this could evolve to something where vendors simply report the status to this centralized system, and it becomes the central place for group by status. That would be a fantastic evolution. We're not there yet, because I think that would make it convenient for vendors and consumers and be less work for administrators to have to track this information. So maybe that's something that could evolve. This could evolve to in the future. Yeah. And then thanks to everyone who participated. I cannot stress how much work this was. I was talking to some old members in the community, and they said this might be one of the, not just one of the biggest collaborations within our hobby, but potentially across many niche hobbies to create something like this. So it's I truly think a testament to how good the community is to be able to kind of come together and try and make something like this work.
Yeah, I think this is a first. I've never seen the mods of all these platforms work so closely together ever during the many years I've been in this hobby.
Yeah, truly, I'll mention a few names here just because I think they really deserve it. Colbert, he's a moderator on Reddit mechanical keyboards and Discord mech group buys, heavily involved. Deadbolt from mechanical keyboards and mech market. Hoffman, been in the hobby for a very long time, moderator of Geek Hack. Omnias, moderator on mech keyboards, mech market, and Discord mech market. And lots of other people. The vendors, thank you so much to the vendors who, this system would be nothing without the vendors. I'll say that many of these vendors who are double, triple A do not have to do this. They have plenty of good reputation. They don't need to market on these platforms, but they're, being humble and participating in this. So I really appreciate them for doing that.
Yeah. And thank you for also, I know you're one of the people who spearheaded this whole thing. So it's great to finally see something after our first call, and I'm excited for this.
Yeah, I'm excited too. Thanks so much for giving us a platform to talk about it. Really appreciate it. You kind of, opened the door to enable this type of thing. So really appreciate your help. And by the time, I don't know when you're releasing this video, but hopefully, we've fallen a little bit behind just because of all the volunteers been busy. But by the time you release it, we should have at least the first, set of vendors with their ratings here. Those who have submitted, thank you. And to the vendors who are going to submit it now, I really appreciate it. Give us some time to kind of process all this information and get it up. It's the initial hurdle that's the hardest, to get all this data in, but hopefully by the end of the year, we'll have this humming and having people report information and maintaining it.
And I would just encourage all the viewers to, like Armenda said, it truly is a system that's made and run by the community. So we're going to need all the reports, just of the everyday enthusiasts to report issues and report wrongdoings so that the admin team can look into it and hopefully update ratings as necessary.
Yeah. And we'll probably call out for volunteers at some point. If you want to temporarily volunteer or you have some time, it can only work through voluntary efforts. There's no financial, we're not taking sponsorship money or any of that stuff. There's no financial stuff here at all. It's purely a voluntary system. So yeah. On that spirit, make sure if you're reporting something that it's truly something we need to look at, not not something that's a minor thing or what have you. But yeah.